Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Domas. I'm the Director of the Michigan Chemistry Council, and welcome to this webinar on Candid Conversations with Environmental Advocates. I want to thank our webinar series sponsors, Amway, the American Chemistry Council, and US Ecology, and all those who have been able to join us and figure out the access information. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, particularly at this natural inflection point, so to speak, for policy and law and many other things following the recent elections, especially as we look ahead to continued changes at the federal and state levels. I think it's very timely. We are joined today by three panelists: Margethe Kearney from the Environmental Law and Policy Center, or ELPC, Sean Hammond from the Michigan Environmental Council, or MEC, and Joe Fedewa from the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, or LCV. Just to get all the acronyms out of the way. I will be moderating the discussion, maybe participating a bit myself, but looking forward to hearing the views of our panelists. We encourage you to submit questions using the chat or Q&A features, and we will be recording and sharing this later for folks' enjoyment. So I want to begin by just asking your panelists to briefly introduce themselves and tell us about their organization. What's its brief history? Who are the members? I mean, who constitutes your organization essentially, and what is it that you do? How do you go about advancing your mission? So let's start with Margethe. If you would take us away briefly.
Great, thanks John, and thanks so much for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Margethe Kearney. I am a senior attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and I'm located in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I am our Grand Rapids office, and we are, ELPC is a Midwestern focused advocacy organization. We were founded in 1993 by our current executive director, and the idea was that it's really important to have regional environmental groups because regions differ so much in the issues that they face and in the way that they need to solve their problems, right? What works in California doesn't always work in Michigan. And so we focus our advocacy partly on litigation. I'm a lawyer, so about a third of our organization are lawyers, and we appear in front of the Michigan Public Service Commission. We practice in federal court and in state court, challenging government decisions and agency decisions that we think are inappropriate or not based on solid evidence. We do all of that with a policy lens in mind because we have a lot of policy folks who are also trying to solve bigger issues like nutrient pollution into the Great Lakes and things like that. So we have a very regional perspective in all of the Midwestern Great Lakes states, but I really focus here in Michigan on the issues that are impacting us. And our members are by our individuals by and large.
Great. Sean, same questions?
Yeah, thanks for having me here today. And I will say, if I start using acronyms, catch me. Alphabet soup happens a lot in the environmental world. So again, Sean Hammond, I'm the policy director at Michigan Environmental Council. So we were founded in 1980. This is our 40th anniversary year that we really wanted to celebrate and do some fun things, but
2020
COVID. So we were founded by 6 leading environmental orgs back in 1980. And since then, we have grown from 1 staffer and 6 orgs to about 80 member organizations and 15 staff. We're located in Lansing, and our founding mission was to be the voice of the environmental community in Lansing. Before then, there wasn't a coordinated environmental voice in Lansing. And so the leading groups decided they needed a presence there consistently. So over time, our membership has grown to include groups like ELPC and LCV are both members of MEC. We also have groups like Michigan Trout Unlimited, Michigan Nurses Association, Transit Riders United, Western Michigan Environmental Action Council, Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council, Huron River Watershed Council. So, anything that has a touch on the environment, we have a member group that is representative. So, we are really the advocates in Lansing as a C3. So we do not engage in electoral politics. Instead, we focus on education of Lansing lawmakers and decision makers in the administration. And I think the one thing I could say about our org is that we have the deepest policy expertise bench. We have 5 policy experts on various topics in our staff, and I think we're the deepest environmental org in Lansing in terms of specific policy expertise. So we have an energy program and drinking water program, surface water program, public health program, and then as policy director, I get to catch everything that doesn't fall under those 4 neat categories.
Great. And Joe, same for you?
Thanks, John. Joe Fedewa, I'm the Government Affairs Manager at Michigan LCV, the League of Conservation Voters. Come to this space, this environmental world, relatively fresh. I used to be a former House staffer in the State House for 4 years. Worked for a couple different Lansing area House members, one in West Lansing, one in kind of the South Lansing area. Was able to staff them on Health Policy Committee, the Insurance Committee, Transportation, Appropriations, and Agriculture Committee over those 4 years. So now with LCV, I work out of our Lansing office, primarily representing LCV as a lobbyist and kind of a liaison in front of the legislature and the governor's administration. We have a two-person lobbying team, so I do have one other person in Lansing with me doing this work. We have about 30 staffers all over the state, so we're statewide, nonpartisan, but very political statewide environmental organization with those offices, like I mentioned, in Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Lansing, and Traverse City, actually. Hopefully opening one in Detroit relatively soon. The pandemic's put a little damper on that Detroit office, but that's kind of in the short-term goals here. And we're connected. We have a federal affiliate called the League of Conservation Voters, just LCV in DC. They're doing the federal work in front of Congress and the White House. We also have state affiliated state LCVs across the nation. I'd say maybe half to 2/3 of the states have some version of us in their states doing similar work. Our mission is really boil it down as simple as it can be, is to protect Michigan's air, land, and water. So most of our focus, at least recently, has been on clean energy work as well as clean water. Some public lands preservation work sprinkled in there, and then as well as some good governance work. So we work on policy, transparency, which is in the legislature, and then electoral reforms, good government electoral reforms as well. So, you know, Sean mentioned MEC has a very strong C3 component. We do have a C3 component, but we also have a C4 part of our work as well. So we are very political. We say we do it all. We do the issue education side of things. We do the lobbying. We also do a lot of electoral work, which is sort of our bread and butter. So heavily involved in PAC spending. We do endorsements, both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. Also some field work for the field work and PAC and electoral work that other nonprofits just can't do if they don't have both the C3 and C4 side of things. So we really lean into that. We don't shy away from the political work we do. We try to elect candidates with shared values, shared conservation values. We educate those elected officials once they're in office, and then we track the performance and hold them accountable when they are in office. So that's kind of LCV in a nutshell.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, the LCV scorecard is usually the most common barometer, you know, for better or for worse, depending on how people are looking at it, maybe when evaluating kind of at the federal and a little bit less maybe at the state levels on how green a candidate is usually. I don't know how long your national or state affiliates have been using that, but seems to be kind of the standard that's cited. And I think what's interesting too, Joe coming from the Democratic side, working in the legislature for members, correct? And Sean having worked for a Republican member, and both now, you know, with your organizations, and Margethe having worked in corporate law, so working in environmental law. So very diverse backgrounds, very interesting backgrounds. You've seen all different kind of sides or perspectives on the issues that you bring now to your current roles. I would just ask you now, maybe briefly, without going into super detail, but what would be your top 3 current advocacy priorities you've been working on in 2020, maybe going into 2021? So start with Margethe again.
Sure. So I would say that climate change broadly is one of our biggest issues, and that manifests itself in the clean energy, renewable energy, and energy efficiency work that we do in front of the Public Service Commission. and working to avoid expensive infrastructure investments that customers are going to be stuck with for years and years and years when we transition to a whole new way of organizing our the delivery of energy in Michigan. So that's kind of two of the three, because those are two big things. And then clean water, I'd say, is our other big priority right now, with a particular focus on nutrient pollution and agricultural runoff. We've been doing a lot of work in Lake Erie from sort of focused from our Ohio office, but we're working in Michigan too on the new CAFO permit that has been released, and actually working with MEC on a lot of that. And so that's a big focus of ours right now.
Great. And Sean, top three priorities?
So I'm gonna, since we do have a lot of different priorities and we're currently going through this process right now, I'm gonna flag kind of one of mine and then a couple of our organizations. And the top one for me right now is what we're working on with John and others, which is the solid waste rewrite, to get that across the finish line and actually redo our solid waste management laws for the first time in 25 years. Hopefully we can get it done before January. I really, really hope we can get it done before January and it doesn't carry over to 2021. But that's kind of one of my personal top priorities at the organization. We're also working on climate change. As Margethe said, I don't want to copy her homework. But I'll flag high water is one of the ones that we're working on and watching pretty particularly. We hope the Great Lakes have crested. It seems like the Army Corps has kind of predicted that's the case, at least for this year. But this is something that we've got not just homes at risk, but a lot of our drinking water and other infrastructure, municipal infrastructure, relies on like gravity feeds and things that don't work when water gets as high as it did. So thinking through that planning for long-term changes with climate change. And then lastly, the other thing that we're really focusing on right now is drinking water, which are things like Filter First, where we want to get filters in schools and daycares for water, instead of trying to test lead and then test for lead and try to track it down that way. Just putting in filters is the most cost efficient and protective way to do this. And then of course, drinking water accessibility. I'm going to say the wrong word, but I'm going to say affordability because the right word's not coming to my head. But really making sure people have access to clean drinking water and it isn't cut off due to affordability issues. So those are kind of our top three, I'd say right now, to not copy off of Margarita or what I'm anticipating Joe's probably going to say.
All right. What's Joe going to say?
As you can see, a lot of overlap, between our organizations, which is a good thing. I'll copy off both of their homework. I think in the next few weeks, in the really short term, I think our main focus is codifying the Governor Whitmer's executive order on water shutoffs that she submitted early, I think in March. Obviously, with the Supreme Court, this decision to kind of roll back her executive authority, that those water shutoffs, that executive order is null and void. So we do want to codify that legislatively as soon as possible to make sure people have water, clean water to fight, wash their hands and whatnot to fight the pandemic. I'd say clean water and water affordability in general. PFAS contamination is all over our state. We do need money to remediate those PFAS sites. We do need to talk about long-term water affordability in general. And then we need to upgrade our drinking water infrastructure. So replace lead service lines, talk about having water filtration systems in schools, like Sean mentioned, with the Filter First programs, protecting groundwater through runoff, right? Through CAFOs and factory farms. And the second biggest bucket I'd get into is clean energy, electric vehicles, and climate policy. So really allowing residents and communities to we say grow their own solar. So have their own solar panels, really get the full benefit and incentives to having what we call distributed energy generated in their communities. And then just promote EVs, promote the sale of EVs, improve the charging infrastructure in our state, allow the facilitation of sales as easy as possible, and then increase energy efficiency programs. So get funds to programs like the Michigan Saves program, also fund programs like the Green Revolving Fund that can increase energy increase energy efficiency in state facilities. Lastly, real quick, I'll put a bow on it with expansions, like I said, good governance reforms, specifically expansions, expanding FOIA to the legislature and executive office. I think that's long overdue. It's passed the House. The last, as long as I can remember, really, probably the last 3 or 4 sessions, it's passed the House and died in the Senate. So we really need to get that done next year. Get back to some good transparency and good governance in Michigan.
All right, thank you. Republicans have controlled the Michigan legislature since 2010, and that is going to continue at least for the next 2 years. We've also had 2 terms of a Republican governor during that time before the last 2 years under Governor Whitmer. So looking back over sort of that recent history, what would you say is kind of your big picture perspective on how Michigan environmental policy making has gone? And maybe what would you say, just for kicks and giggles, what was the worst environmental law or action you think was taken during that time, either by the legislature or the governor? So, or the PSC, I suppose, too, Margethe. So if you want to start, Margethe.
I'm going to kick it actually to Sean and Joe, because I think that it's better to give them more time on this.
Okay.
Right. I mean, I guess I can go ahead and start. So I got my start in Lansing in 2009. So I kind of came in right at the cusp of this decade. You know, it's been a weird decade for environmental policy kind of nationally, as well as in Michigan. We've had a number of changes, of course, and under Governor Snyder, and then we had President Obama at the time. So you had a lot of federal push on a lot of environmental policies, on things like WOTUS and things like that. Whereas in Michigan, we were doing some rollbacks and some changes on our environmental policy. And, we had a wetlands law that is now out of compliance with the Clean Water Act, and still is to this day, because we can't can't get the traction to fix it. So and of course, we've had a few crises thrown in the middle of this on our environmental side. Of course, with Flint, with high water, with low water, with Lake Erie algal blooms. So, I'd say we're treading water in Michigan. We had some of the best environmental laws in the country, especially around like wetlands and some things, because we do have a delegated program. We've made some gains in some areas, but we've also made some backslides. I'll put from our perspective right now, the worst action is the no stricter than federal law. We still think that has a great detriment to the state, especially as we look at things like lead service lines, where that rule was thankfully started before the federal rule, and things like the PFAS MCLs. Again, there was no federal standard, but as we get into some of these other toxic contaminants and things like that, especially with what the Trump administration has done over the past 4 years in terms of setting environmental standards, I think that is going to be a hurdle that's difficult to cross in an already very difficult Administrative Procedures Act. And even before Andy Such retired, we've had long conversations with him about how we just need to trash the APA and rebuild it, because it's so onerous right now for both private parties and government to try to follow and get into. And this is one of those things that we just need clear, concise pathways, and adding no stricter than federal on top of the permit panels or the rules panel and all the other procedures under the APA, to us is just another hurdle in trying to get clear, consistent rule packages out that are easy to follow.
Right. Joe, want to take a shot at that?
Hopefully I can fill in a little bit here, because I think those are excellent answers. I think overall, from our perspective, look, we've regressed quite a bit. I came in, Sean's got much more experience than me, but I came in the middle of the decade, so I don't really have that perspective from pre 2010. But I think there's no doubt from our minds that we've regressed the last decade when it comes to environmental policy. We used to be a leader in the country, but we've fallen behind quite a bit. So the regulation, obviously, as Sean mentioned, has been rolled back, but the enforcement as well. If we could just enforce some of these rules and regulations on the books, that would go a long way. MDARD, if they could just enforce some of these CAFO nutrient runoff rules. I mean, we'd be happy with that. If, you know, we've seen instances, we saw the green goo last fall or early this year in Madison Heights. I mean, if we could just enforce some of these from the administrative perspective, we'd be in decent shape. I think state and local funding is an issue. I mean, that's been reprioritized elsewhere. We've seen cuts to revenue sharing. This has led to an underfunding in our crumbling water infrastructure. I think we're underinvesting. I think PSC and Lansing did a report, about $500 million a year. We're underinvesting in water infrastructure. So about $500 million. So that's a serious problem that, you know, that's going to be a long-term problem to solve with money being tight, obviously in Lansing, but that's got to be a priority. As far as your second part of your question, what's the one piece of legislation that we weren't too thrilled about? No stricter than federal. Obviously, like Sean said, that's the biggest thing. That ties into everything with administrative rules. If I can cheat and do a couple more here, I would say from our perspective, we thought the Line 5 deal in late 2018 was pretty short-sighted. We think just a general lack of action across the board when it comes to really time-sensitive environmental and public health issues. So drinking water protections, there has been a whole lot on until recently. No state septics code, lack of materials management policy up until this Part 115, which hopefully we get across the finish line. But a lot of the stuff has really been put on the back burner or no burner at all. So there's quite a bit. It's tough to pin down one, but I guess I would go back to the no stricter than federal as the kind of most damaging environmental legislation that's passed the last decade.
I should note the worst environmental thing that's happened in the past decade was the Flint water crisis, but I figured that kind of went without saying. So took it down to what the next was.
Yeah, and not as easy to pinpoint that as something that was, it wasn't one contributing factor or causation of many confluence of factors. Staying on this note, and Margethe, if you wanted to take a shot at it or not, I'm going to just briefly want to touch on polarization of politics. It was early in my time working at the Chemistry Council when I had a Republican legislator told me on a bill, the Republican caucus was basically going to be voting for the bill because the Sierra Club was whipping against it. So they knew it must be the right thing to do. And I was like, thanks, but not. I was a little, they kind of were very upfront about that. So how do you work across the aisle? How do you work with people of different parties, whether it's legislators or the administration? Because it seems like right now there's very little middle ground.
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and it's something that matters to me and that I see, I think, in a very particular way, because as you mentioned, I spent 10 years working in private practice at a big law firm, and I represented companies on contaminated site cleanup and on compliance with environmental laws. And so I have seen that side of the coin. And I now am working for a group whose goal is to put policies in place that are protective of the environment. And a lot of those policies are actually pretty beneficial to the companies that are being regulated, right? Because impairment of the environment doesn't come without cost, and it's a cost that we all pay. It is often a cost that companies pay. And I think that my experience shows me that most companies have an intention to follow the law. Some of them don't, and we need to enforce and have strong enforcement against those, as Joe mentioned. But many just want to know what the rules are and how to follow them. And it is not useful to have kind of knee-jerk responses to, oh, well, the Sierra Club wants this thing, so we're going to go to the total opposite, right? Because there is likely someplace in there where you're going to find the regulated universe saying, actually, it would be helpful if we could craft it this way, because we want to do the right thing. And if we craft the regulation this way, we do the right thing, and everybody is held to that standard. And so we don't have to kind of compete against the bad actors or worry about the bad actors. We can do things well, and we have regulatory certainty because we're passing a bill that has broad support. It has bipartisan support. So we're not going to see the kind of flip-flopping that that sometimes happens when you can't get groups together to really support legislation. And so I think that and I'm a litigator, right? So I'm used to being adverse to people, but still having to have conversations with them and work things out with them. And that's a space that I'm very comfortable in. And so I am often kind of dismayed at the degree to which we don't have those conversations and sit down and talk about, like, okay, if you're opposed to this, why is that? How can we fix that? How can we make it better and actually achieve some goals here? And ELPC in particular is an organization, part of the reason I was attracted to it is that's kind of the culture of our group, is that we want to find those solutions and we want to help get them in place.
And you're taking probably a long-term view, looking at things over the course of years and decades, and not just what's the issue of the week or the month and who's winning on that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that isn't to say that there aren't like these serious crises, right? Like, I think it's challenging. Incrementalism is challenging to a lot of environmentalists, because when you look at issues like climate change, it's very hard to sort of take a long-term look at that. And when you do, it's not very encouraging. So it's not to say that there isn't a sense of urgency, but I agree with you that it is like, this is a marathon. This whole game that we are playing is a marathon, and we should treat it that way.
Okay. Joe or Sean, especially if you're working at the Capitol, how do you work with different people when you walk in? They've got a letter behind their name, and they may simplistically approach an issue, but how do you break out of that?
Yeah, so this is a struggle, and you mentioned I came from a Republican background. I mean, from my perspective, the environment should never be a partisan issue, and I think for a long time in Michigan, especially, it hasn't been, because we have the Great Lakes, we have our hunting and fishing, and we have this outdoor ethos that we all want to see the environment protected, and there's still some of that happening, but I'd say over the past 10, 20 years, we've slowly seen this degrade. I mean, we're to the point where a pandemic is partisan issue for some reason. And the environment has fallen prey to that as well. Like you said, like, just because Sierra Club or LCV or MEC supports, that means they're going to oppose. And that's not a place we want to be. And we'd like to find solutions. And that's kind of where we pride ourselves as well, is trying to be that neutral broker of, like, this is what the science says. This is what best practices are. Let's get to a place where it's beneficial for everybody. I think we did that with 115 to some degree. And I think that's probably a good example that we should use going forward on, like, here's how you get things done. But, I have to say that I think what's missing is those relationships, not just between us and lawmakers, but between lawmakers and other lawmakers. So I have to put my plug here that term limits are really what's driving partisanship in Michigan. I think we'll find that more once the gerrymandering commission kind of comes into play next year. I think we'll still see some hyperpartisanship because unlike before, where people will get to, work with these people for years and get to know their kids and get to understand, like, where their worldview is. And, I'm a grocer and you're a lawyer and you're a farmer and you're an educator. And look, we all served here in the House for a decade together. And, I watched your kid grow from 2 to grade school, and they're running track now. Like, that's missing because you have 6 years and then a subset of those get another 6 or another 8. And that's it. And that's the end. You're all, by the time you figured out how legislation actually works, you're looking for another job because you only have 2 years left, for the vast majority of lawmakers in Lansing. And that's, from my perspective, that is really what the problem is we can't get to that solutions point because we don't have time to educate and have people learn about all these very, very important issues out there. Because there's a lot, and a legislator has a lot on their plate. And if they only have a total of 6 to 14 years to learn it, what incentive is there to dig in on these issues and actually become, really, really hot on one of them, if you're just going to leave?
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Joe?
I think a lot of that's right. I think the term limits have been damaging, to long-term relationships. You might have, there's no incentive now. I mean, if you're going to be gone in 2, 4, 6 years, why do I care about reaching across and building those relationships? before you might have served on a committee with the same person for 10, 15 years. That's just not the case anymore. I think the districts are a problem, the gerrymandered districts. There's, if you know you're going to win with 60, 70, 80% of the vote, what's my incentive to represent the other 30, 40%, right? I mean, I don't really have to bridge the divide there. I think, the redistricting commission is going to help, but you're still going to see some of that. Thankfully, I think when we're talking federally in DC, I think that, the media ecosystem is a serious problem. I think people are self-selecting the news they're getting from. Luckily, in Lansing, we have some great reporters covering the Capitol, which it could be a lot worse, right? If we had some really partisan reporters, I think God knows where we'd be with polarization. But I think in general, split government can be a good thing. I think from our perspective, we've seen a lot less damaging legislation the last session, this last term, because we've had a Democratic governor and Republican House and Senate. Split government's not a bad thing. I mean, I'm actually reading the book right now about the co-speakers in the state house in 1993 and 94. They said they had the most productive legislatures in Michigan's modern history. So, I mean, it could work. There's just got to be political will to get there. So removing some of these barriers, if there's some way to removing or at least amending term limits a little bit to maybe extend that or modify them a little bit might help. It may not be a silver bullet there, but I think that's a starting point.
Okay. I'd like to get your thoughts on when you decide to try to compromise and improve policy and come to the middle on something, or when you'll take a stand, even if it means you're going to lose, but you might move the needle. I think the perception of some in the business community is that the goalposts are always moving and folks are just trying to be oppositional to sort of move the paradigm and always be changing the conversation, as opposed to really finding a middle ground on policy. But how do you decide that, whether it's on legislation or in the law or the PSC? So as much as you can share about your personal or your organizational strategy on that.
I mean, I have kind of a very clear example of that, I think, in Michigan. So Consumers Energy, recently did an integrated resource planning process where they made a decision about what kind of resources they're going to use going forward. And their proposal did not include any new fossil fuel units and was very heavily dependent on solar energy. And that is great news, right, from my perspective. And that was a case that was settled. There were other issues in that case that, created some complications and some problems, and we had to talk about, but it was a case that was settled. And where a lot of groups with a lot of different interests reached compromise. But it was very clear, and this came across in conversations with consumers, like, my job is to push you, right? I am an advocate for clean energy and for what's the next step. And I'm always looking forward to what's the next step. So yes, the goalposts are always changing because we're always going to get better at doing this stuff. We're always going to get better at pollution control technology. We're always going to get better at, technologies in renewable energy and energy storage. And part of the reason we do that is that there are people like me saying, it's great that you're doing that. What else can you do? What more can you do? How far can we go? And so I think that we take an approach where we're like, we are absolutely willing to reach settlement for good outcomes, but we're going to keep pushing you to keep doing better in the future.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's helpful. Joe or Sean?
I think we take mostly like a similar approach where, once we set out to negotiate something, we're going to set a set of goalposts and agree to those unless something drastic changes outside. That doesn't mean that we're going to be happy with necessarily the final result. And, we like to tell people when that occurs, hey, we will be neutral on this bill, but we're still going to put out a press release blasting it, right? Like that's, and we're upfront and open and saying like, hey, we get it. This is where this is going to go. And this is what needs to happen, but we're still not thrilled. And we really try to base this off of, a couple different things, but one of them is the science. And, I think a lot of times environmentalists get accused of moving goalposts when we've just found out more about a pollutant or about a system or something like that. So, take PFAS, for example. This is one that we are learning. We stopped learning more every day now. I think we've kind of settled into a little bit of a growth curve here, but there was a while there where every other week there was something else coming out about PFAS is in here. PFAS is doing this. PFAS has, this potential impact on people. And so, we may have said something at first, 2 months later, there's a bunch of new science. Well, now we understand this better. And clearly what we said at first wasn't good enough. So that's where I hope that that's not viewed as moving goalposts, but that's what occasionally I know we end up having to do. But we always are trying to approach, using the best science, the best policy from other states out there that we can find, and really work towards that middle ground. I think a true middle ground. I think there's a lot of folks in the legislature that think middle ground just means you take 50% from one and 50% from the other, and that's not necessarily the actual middle. In a lot of ways. So, we try to and that's, our goal is always to be honest brokers and be like, this is where we're at. If you vote, and being a C3, it's kind of nice that we can, yeah, you voted against us this time. We'll be back in your office to talk about wetlands next week. Right. Like that's, it's not going on a scorecard. It's not going on a thing. And that to us is a benefit. I know the scorecard is also a really good benefit in other ways. Not to diss on scorecards, but that's how we try to approach it is just be honest and straightforward, and then hold accountable if needed.
Joe, are you guys a little more willing to be the bad guys sometimes and put people on notice, do a little bit more of the blasting?
I think the scorecard and the accountability work that we do is the last resort. I mean, I don't think we want to get there. I think we want to be known and build credibility through compromise. And I think that makes you more effective, right? I mean, if committee chairs and other stakeholders are seeing you as an obstructionist organization, you're not going to get reached out to next time, right? They're in one camp. They're going to be a no. Don't worry about giving them a call, seeing what amendments that they want, what changes they want in the bill package. So, but I think if all else fails and that you really can't find that middle ground, which we try to seek as much as possible, then yeah, I think accountability tools are appropriate, right? I mean, ultimately at the end of the day, our mission is to do what's best for the public interest, do what's best for Michigan's air, land, and water, like I mentioned. And if, it requires you to sound the alarm to the public that your elected officials are doing something that's compromising your public health, then I think that's necessary. But again, I think it's a last resort.
Okay. I'd like to touch on a question here someone had submitted. It's basically how you engage your advocate base. You work with a lot of individuals that are very passionate, and that's part of the model or the approach you take. How have you been able to deploy people, and especially during COVID, what are some of the ways that people are being involved in your work and outreach to policymakers carrying your message?
I feel like we have a routine here of me going first, so I'll just jump in.
Fine, yeah.
We have folks who work on social media and who understand how all of those things work. And so I think it's really helpful that that our organization and that our issues tend to be really important to all ages of people. And a lot of them are younger people who are very adept at using social media. And that I think has helped during the COVID crisis to continue the kind of advocacy that we see on issues. It also helps us reach people who are in more remote areas, who also tend to have a big connection to the environment. And so that I've also found is very useful. I came into this never, when you're in private practice, all you say is no comment. You don't actually have conversations with anyone. You can't. And now I can, because it doesn't really, I can't say anything wrong, right? My lawyers can't yell at me. I can be honest and I can be open.
I thought you did the yelling. I thought that was what your job was. Telling all the communications people to shut up. Shut
Stop talking. Don't say anything more, right? Yeah, which is a big, and I've given talks and I've had conversations with a lot of industry folks about the degree to which you should be open, and maybe that's a good strategy, but that's a whole nother conversation. But it's much easier to have that kind of conversation with reporters, and to get the message out there, because you're not worried about saying something that your lawyers are going to yell at you for later.
I will say we feel that very acutely at times.
Yeah.
And look at your side, so to speak, and maybe with a little bit of envy, for what it's worth. So going back with the question, Joe and Sean, how do you deploy your advocates?
So we have member groups and member organizations and not individual members. So I'll toss this to Joe.
A couple different ways. I mean, we try to be as transparent as possible with our members. So whether that's action alerts about what's going on in Lansing. I mean, obviously the average person in the state doesn't have the capacity to follow, the Gongwer and MERS or whatever capital publication you follow on every single day on what's going to happen in committee. They don't have the capacity to do it. So try to be as transparent as possible. Get those action alerts out to people's emails and whatnot. Say, look, this is happening. If you strongly care about it, reach out to your elected official. But also translating that into political power too. I mean, building those grassroots lists that you could then turn around maybe the next year and get them to volunteer and engage in the political process. I think is healthy. So a few different ways, but I think it starts with that transparency and those action alerts that we send out to members. We'll do the work, and we'll kind of synthesize the information that they need to know based on what's going on in Lansing.
Yeah, information is definitely key. I want to touch on a very specific issue that I've found very interesting and meaningful to our members, and actually we have a lot of overlap with policy with your groups on, and that's on energy. It often seems like there's three groups of stakeholders involved, and I'm oversimplifying, but you've got the utilities, who are very central, they have their perspective, and there's ratepayers, and I'll use industrial sort of ratepayers for that, even though there's other classes and have different interests, and then environmental advocates. And it's usually that you can get two out of those three on board with certain policy, but you rarely, maybe the consumer's IRP was the exception, but rarely can you satisfy those three. And you got to throw someone under the bus. And I'll talk about like solar generation. Utilities love solar, but only when they own it. They don't want the customer to own it. Electric choice and just market competition. The environmental groups and the ratepayers love that sort of stuff in many ways, but the utilities can't stand it. So how can we better work together? Obviously, the utilities have to be a big part of that, but there's such a major force in the legislature, with the administration, at the PSC. How can we find common ground and kind of move maybe all three of us in the right direction?
Well, I think that aligning our interests and talking to each other a little bit more on strategy, which we do, and there are a lot of participants at the Public Service Commission, like ABATE, who are, whose attorneys are very, open and willing to have discussions, and we will often find ourselves on the same side of an issue and supporting each other on an issue. But one thing I would really like to see environmental groups that are working on energy issues and sort of the non-residential customers come together on is the ability to meet corporate goals. So I'm always a little bit troubled when I'm in a case where I see an ABATE, or I see a company that I know has sustainability targets and goals, especially renewable energy goals, and they're taking a position that will make it more challenging for that company to meet those goals in a meaningful way. And so I think that more education and kind of communication about what it will take in front of the commission for those companies to be able to really lead and meet those goals in a cost-effective way, which is key, right? Because now we can do that. Renewable energy, the costs have come down so much that there's just a lot more opportunity out there to really do that in a cost-effective way. So I think that's one space where I feel like I would love to see more collaboration.
Where the rubber meets the road in those rate cases.
Yeah, I'd love to see folks show up. I'd like to see more companies showing up to individual companies to say, you know, we're a huge energy user. Yes, we need reliable energy. We also need renewable energy, and regulated utility, have an obligation to provide that to us at a good price.
Yeah. Joe or Sean, especially in the legislature, I think we all feel outgunned against the big utilities when it comes to lawmaking. Any thoughts on that?
No comment on that, but yeah, no, it's been a struggle. I mean, we got I've been here for two major energy law rewrites, I think, in my time in Lansing, and they were a lot of work. And we also, although MEC is the largest residential ratepayer intervener, so we are not only an environmental group at the MPSC, we are intervening on behalf of each and every resident of the state. For DTE and consumers, not for the UP. So, you know, we have a couple of different lenses that we look at things through, but as Margareta said, renewables are now cheaper. And really that's what, you know, we want to make sure is we're deploying this, and in the legislature, you know, we try to mesh that, what we learn from the MPSC cases that isn't easily digestible to a lot of folks, digest it and then give it to the legislature to understand in a more easy way. Because, you know, I've looked at some of the stuff that we turn in. I'm not an energy expert by any means. I've looked at some of the stuff, and the spreadsheets alone make me dizzy. So, you know, I can't imagine someone who has, you know, 10 different things on their plate on a day understanding that. So, you know, I think it's about trying to take those misconceptions about energy, about base load, and about the cost of renewables and what they can and can't do, and where battery technology is at. So I think there's still a lot of misconceptions in the legislature about like cost of things and how much, you know, wind costs, and if everyone puts solar panels on their home, it'll destabilize the utilities. Whereas really there's a lot of mutual benefits to grid stability when you deploy a lot more of these resources. So, you know, it's a lot of education. I think that's something that larger companies can help bridge that language gap as well, to talk about, like, if we can put up solar panels, it brings stability to consumers' grid because we're not drawing as much during these hours, and we're saving money. Residents are saving money. Consumers are saving. Like, everyone's making out a win here. So why not push for these things, right?
Joe, any thoughts on that?
I would just say a lot of the attention normally goes to the big ticket fights that we, you know, enviros typically have with big utilities about energy production and control. You know, I mean, we have philosophical differences on those. I would say I'd like to see more attention on the stuff that, John, you mentioned that there is common ground on, that there's plenty of work to be done on the electric vehicle front. That DT and consumers would benefit from and would have no problem with, and we could work side by side on, you know, utility scale clean energy development, and then energy efficiency. I mean, if these were all done, I would say, okay, like, let's focus on these big ticket fights. Well, I do think, you know, the distributed generation cap I mentioned earlier is critical, and that needs to be raised now, because we're going to lose solar jobs like today. That should be a primary focus. But you know, in the event that we can't get to an agreement on that with big utilities, I think there's plenty of work to be done the next session on those three areas I just mentioned that we could focus on.
Okay. I have one more question I want to get to, and with everybody's indulgence, I know we got a late start, so just quickly to wrap up with this, if that's all right, that would be just other issues of common ground. And I have 4 that I kind of think of here that we would or are working together on. That would be infrastructure investments, whether it be water, transportation, things like that, that just improve the economy and environmental outcomes across the board. Recycling, that's something we as an industry are very much supportive of and want to move the needle in. Energy efficiency, specifically for buildings and construction. We have a lot of opportunities as a state to do better with that, and some great climate outcomes. And then just climate solutions in general. Again, as companies that provide solutions to different sectors, this is the way they're focusing their growth strategy for the decades to come, is on meeting these solutions. How do you think we can work together in these common issues. And any others you would put forward? Just as the last question. So, Margethe or Joe's, it looks like he's about to.
Look, yeah, dialogue, right? I think historically, at least in my experience, there hasn't been a whole lot of healthy dialogue between environmental groups and some of the other stakeholders early on in the process. With the exception, I know Sean was heavily involved and others were heavily involved in the Part 115 rewrite. That should be a model, I think. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but that should be a model of how we should have systematic problem solving, in the state legislature. I think hopefully, again, that's the finish line, but starts with an early dialogue about getting on the same page and working through the process, especially with these complicated issues. And that I think is lost. But getting over the barrier of skepticism too, with a lot of these groups, with environmental groups, like, assuming we'll be in opposition to something and we'll be dragged kicking and screaming through the process. That's not necessarily the case. We love to be part of a robust stakeholder interest groups that we could really find solutions for the best interest of us all on these.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we need more dialogue and more forums maybe to have that dialogue in. The Michigan Bar Association, actually, there are not a ton of environmental lawyers in Michigan. And when we do get together, right, the 30 of us or so, it's from very different places. And we have conversations about substantive issues, and you can do that, right? Like, we can do that and we can have that dialogue. We need to expand that beyond sort of these small groups and these siloed groups, because that kind of conversation is what will spark ideas and is what will lead to somebody going, hey, that's a really good way of solving that problem that I have. And what if we had legislation that did this or that, or just made policy changes? So I think that we need to have more of that kind of conversation. I think it's hard to figure out how to do that, right? How do you create that space, and how do you make that happen in an organic way? And I'll throw onto your list of things, I think that kind of that land use and brownfields is always a place where we should be working together, because that is a classic area of a space where you can create all sorts of win-win situations. I haven't been involved in that in Michigan, and I know there's a long and storied history of it, but I think that's a place where I would like to see, especially the intersection of, renewable energy and building more solar and things like that, and using some of these old industrial sites. Like, that would be a great place to be able to partner with companies who say, I've got this piece of land and it's not going to be put to any productive use. What can we do with it?
Yeah. Very good call.
And I agree. It's all about talking. And I'll say, Joe mentioned skepticism from the business sides that enviros are always going to oppose. I think I'll take some of that on the enviro side, as we have a lot of our members who believe that, or who are very skeptical of any business goal that's out there. It's all either greenwashing or, you'll never reach it. You're just putting it out there to feel good. And then in 5 years, everyone forgot that you set a 5-year goal for X. And I think in the past, we've seen some of that. So I think there is some fair skepticism there. But I think if we can hit those dialogue points, because I think some of the times the goals aren't met because the systems aren't there to meet them. So one of the things that I work in is the recycling field, of course, as I mentioned. There's a lot of places that want to use more recycled plastic. And they've set corporate goals to, like, Coca-Cola has 50% recycled material in every bottle by 2025 or something like that. The reality is we don't have the systems in place to support that goal at a statewide level. So it's how do we have those conversations with entities who are setting those goals, and have those frank conversations about, like, well, how are you going to achieve that? And, a real answer that we'd love to hear is, we don't know. How can we? Because we want to help. We want to get those. We also want to meet those goals. We probably want to meet more aggressive goals, but I think that's just, again, having those dialogues and having those discussions is key to overcome the skepticism on both sides. That I think we all want to see a better planet, a cleaner planet, a place where we can all live and enjoy. we just have to trust each other that, you know, we're all working towards that same goal. And we really are working towards that same goal by addressing these policy systems problems.
Yeah, I would certainly just add, sort of in conclusion, we're seeing from the industry side that a lot more progress is being made and just changes being made. In fact, it's very rapid in terms of corporate commitments, corporate policies, and the way that these issues are approached. It's very much now, how can we get to solutions, because we recognize that fighting and resisting a lot of this stuff is not in the long term going to be successful. So being able to work together with groups like yours on it, I think is very much going to be an imperative. And frankly, with divided government at the state level and at the federal level, most likely it's going to require more of this, because, I mean, let's be honest, if you have control by all legs of the stool by one party that you work very well with, there's not a lot of motivation maybe to work across those aisles with other groups. So very glad, you know, for the conversation. Look forward to working with you all. If we would see each other in person, you know, that would be great to catch up and have these conversations more. Otherwise, forums like these can continue to be valuable until such time as that's possible. But thank you all. I'll give you all back the rest of your day, your lunch hour, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Again, thanks so much for your time, Joe, Margethe, and Sean. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for
Thank you,
having us.
John.
Appreciate it, John.
All right, bye.
Bye, everyone.